Ambassador Bill Taylor tied acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney to the, quote, irregular diplomacy team actively working between Washington and Ukraine.
I encountered an irregular, informal channel of U.S. policymaking with respect to Ukraine, unaccountable to Congress, a channel that included then Special Envoy Kurt Volker, U.S. Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland, Secretary of Energy Rick Perry, White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, and, as I subsequently learned, Mr. Giuliani.
In fairness, this irregular channel of diplomacy, it's not as outlandish as it could be. Is that correct?
It's not as outlandish as it could be. Yeah, I agree, Mr. Castor.
And the second member of the irregular channel is Ambassador Sondland, who is Senate confirmed, ambassador to the EU. So his involvement here, while not necessarily part of his official duties as the ambassador to the EU, certainly is not outlandish for him to be interested and engaged pursuant to the President or Secretary Pompeo's direction. Correct?
It's a little unusual for the U.S. ambassador to the EU to play a role in Ukraine policy.
Okay. And, it might be irregular, but it's certainly not outlandish.
Yeah, Ambassador Taylor left completely speechless on that one.
Jonathan Lemire, the defense is going well for the Republicans, is it not? I mean, in a sort of Washington General sort of way. The Globetrotters are only beating them by 103 points, and Krusty the Clown has, again, placed his money on the Washington Generals because they're due.
They are. There's only so many you can lose in a row, I suppose. No, you're right. I mean, and I think that was representative of what we've seen from the beginning of this entire impeachment inquiry, that the Republicans have really struggled to defend what happened. The facts are not on their side. They're left grasping for conspiracy theories. David Nunes spent the first minutes of his opening statement in the fever swamps of the extreme right, trying to push back on some of this stuff. We've seen that the president, ordering the Republicans in the House and the Senate to not fight on process, to not suggest that, hey, quid pro quos, maybe it's not the best scenario, but it's not unusual and it's certainly not unimpeachable. Instead, to try to say, defend what he did on its merits, and that's left a lot of them very uncomfortable. The president himself yesterday attempted to take the position that he was too busy to pay attention, despite the fact that he tweeted and retweeted about 3 dozen times during the day when he spoke to reporters twice at the Oval Office alongside President Erdogan of Turkey. He said that he tried to project the idea that he was attending to the people's business and therefore was not focused in on what was happening on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue. According to our reporting, though, there's certainly been some frustration among White House allies, among the president and his confidants, thinking that the Republicans sort of missed an opportunity yesterday, that it wasn't a great day for them. They certainly are aware that these career officials, these decorated officials who are sort of pretty hard to malign, they've worked for both Republicans and Democrats, carried the day with their respectability, with their note-taking, and their commitment to a strong American foreign policy.
Yeah, it just does Republicans no good to try to trash these foreign policy professionals. Oh, but yeah, Donald Trump too busy to watch. Yeah, he doesn't watch Morning Joe anymore. Hi, Donald. How you doing?
Oh, goodness.
Reverend Al, it seems to me, Rev, that if these Republicans were intelligent, if they did read books, of course, but they've promised us they're not going to, and we have no reason to doubt their word, do we? But if, Rev, they had sense, any common sense, they would have followed the advice of one of the president's most aggressive defenders several weeks ago, who said, listen, he did it. All right? Everybody knows he did it. The evidence is going to come out that he did it. Yes, there was a quid pro quo. Yes, Donald Trump shook down the Ukrainians to get dirt on Joe Biden. Okay, let's just admit that up front and say, okay, yeah, he did it. So what? It's not impeachable. And that is the sum of the Republicans' argument, because they've been fighting this and talking about hearsay and talking about how it was a botched burglary and talking. No, it's been drip, 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 drip. Instead of just admitting that the president did extort the Ukrainians and go from there. But they haven't done it. They've mishandled it. And every day is a new revelation. Every day is a new embarrassment. Every day is another reason for more Americans to suspect Donald Trump should possibly be impeached and removed from office.
That was the most startling thing to me about yesterday, is they seem to go back to try to defend what is clearly indefensible. It would have been a much better strategy to go with, as you said, where they had said, yes, he did it, but it is not impeachable. It doesn't rise to the level of an impeachable act. They went all the way back to try to unprove what is clearly evident to have happened. To act like the Ambassador Miller would have just fabricated that a staff member was in a restaurant and heard what they heard. If you're going to lie, you don't need to go through a staff member in a restaurant. It was so elaborate that clearly the American public, looking at this man that personifies dignity, telling their story, you would have to believe it, because if you were going to go through telling some fairy tale, you certainly wouldn't have an elaborate fairy tale like that. It would have been much better for them to say, yes, he did it, but it doesn't rise to the level of a high crime or misdemeanor, and let's move on. They're trying to now insult the intelligence of the American people, and I think it's going to backfire on them. And to bring Jordan in, who was supposed to come with all this bombast and fire and whistles, and he failed to do it. It was absolutely a flop for them.
You know what they say in Ohio State? That's Strauss. But anyway, Willie, you know, I talked about this at the beginning, but it is really fascinating. They attacked the whistleblower for providing hearsay evidence. And then they're made fools of when all of these people testify, and it's, of course, not hearsay, it's firsthand evidence. And now they're doing the same thing with this phone call in the restaurant. Say, oh, it's hearsay. It's second, third, fourth, fourth-rate testimony. He said, she said, he said. They're going to have the guy testifying who was at that table. They're going to take Americans to that table where they heard Donald Trump demanding updates on the shakedown and whether they had agreed to the Biden investigation. So once again, a couple of days from now, Republicans are going to look like idiots again.
And what are they going to say to that testimony? Well, he was there and he heard the president's voice through the phone. How could he have heard that? He doesn't know what the president said. There's also a whole other question, which you alluded to, that the ambassador to the EU is just blowing up the president's cell phone at all hours of the night to report back on an investigation in Ukraine. But yeah, and again, I'll say Lieutenant Colonel Vindman is going to testify next week. That is not hearsay. He was on the July 25th phone call. He heard it with his own ears, and he'll testify to that. Heidi Prisbilla.
So, Willie, do they? I just want to ask, Willie, do they want hearsay or not? Like, they complain about the whistleblower and hearsay, so they've got somebody in Vindman who was on the call.
Yeah,
right?
That would help.
And now, what do they want? Now, Lindsey Graham's going, I'm not going to even let this come to the Senate until I hear from the whistleblower. Why? You said his testimony was hearsay.
Right.
And now we find out the evidence. And now you prefer hearsay evidence to a first-hand account. Why, Lindsey, you're changing your tune, and it seems almost as if you're not interested in the truth getting out. That's fascinating.
Remember, he's chief among Republicans who said, I'm not even going to read the transcripts of the testimony. I'm not interested. The whole process is a sham, even though I'm the chair of the Judiciary Committee and a potential juror in this impeachment trial. Heidi, I'm curious, as you cover Capitol Hill, how both sides feel like it went yesterday. We sat at this moment yesterday morning, 24 hours ago, and we said, on the Democratic side, don't let it become a circus. I think Chairman Schiff achieved that. He didn't take some of the taunts and the bait put out out by Republicans. On the Republican side, I mean, we heard that argument from Steve Castor, the GOP counsel. That wasn't some last-ditch Hail Mary. He was the first line of questioning, and his argument seemed to be, well, it wasn't that outlandish. Also, don't forget, Hunter Biden, that was bad too, which of course is not what we're talking about here directly in the impeachment inquiry. So how did both sides in your private conversations feel it went yesterday?
Right. I'm glad that you're going to have Representative Castro on, because there was a poignant moment where he asked Bill Taylor, hey, attempted robbery, attempted murder, those are still crimes, right? And Bill Taylor said, right, because the Republican argument seems to be here that the president never robbed the bank, and we haven't talked to the guy who called the cops. But let me just walk you through some of those arguments specifically, because in speaking with Democrats, they said basically that the Republicans were asking you to disbelieve what you just heard in the hearing on point number one, that there was no pressure on the Ukrainians. Bill Taylor said that the Ukrainians at a certain point really became desperate, that the defense minister was so upset he was going to fly to Washington, and that after that July 25th phone call, that Zelensky really was ready to cave. Number two, that the aid was not jeopardized. This is something that I want to flag, because I did speak with Democrats, and in the coming days, what you're going to hear is that the aid was jeopardized, that the aid was a couple weeks away from essentially the Ukrainians getting nothing. The aid wasn't released until September 11th. The end of the fiscal year was September 30th, guys. So if the whistleblower hadn't come forward, who knows what would have happened, because as it was pointed out, it only got released 2 days after the whole whistleblower report blew up, and it seemed like Zelensky was on his heels and ready to cave to the president. The third point, that there was no investigation into the Bidens. Again, it seemed like they were ready to agree to that. It was just that Zelensky didn't have a chance to go on CNN because everything blew up. Final point I want to make is in speaking with Representative Keating from Massachusetts. He sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on the Europe Subcommittee, and he said, look, in addition to some of this additional evidence that came out today, there was something very important that happened, because in speaking to my constituents back home, the piece that's been missing is that people haven't understood how this affects them personally. Well, here you have a decorated Vietnam veteran threatening to quit his post, cabling the Secretary of State for the first time, because he is saying that Russia is violating all of the security protocols, treaties, and rules that have kept us and Europe safe for 70 years. And here we are trying to kneecap the country that is the front line against all of that aggression. This is something that we should all be concerned about. This is something that affects us, that affects our grandchildren. The president came this close. Think about it, 2 weeks from pulling all of this funding from beneath the Ukrainians, because we're going to see also an additional testimony that this money accounts for a significant portion, not only of their military aid, but their GDP.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.